Nature doesn't discriminate, and neither should we. So David Attenborough's documentaries show us that we can go to the depths of the ocean, the plains of the savannah, to the isolation and cold of the Antarctic. However, for 2/3 of disabled people, the armchair is as close to the natural world as they will get. Many disabled people are deciding against visiting tourist attractions due to the general lack of information on accessibility, as stated in the British Tourism Survey of 2013, the Great British Day Visit Survey, and the Disability Holiday Directory. As someone who is really passionate about the natural world and who happens to have a mild physical disability called cerebral palsy, I could empathise with other disabled people who are experiencing barriers at their local nature reserves, which has meant they could not fully enjoy the natural surroundings around them. I was shocked about how little this issue was being, how little this issue of nature reserves accessibility was being talked about on a national level. And in 2016 I decided I had to do something about it. So I developed a campaign called All for Nature and Nature for All, which aims to make nature reserves accessible for all disabled people by conducting access audits on nature reserves and consulting with local disability groups about possible improvements, as well as educating and informing those working within the conservation sector about the ways in which they can make their nature reserves more accessible. And I eventually hope to go and speak to local disability groups, schools, colleges and residential homes, spreading awareness about how nature can be accessible for all, and by doing mini workshops and talks, informing people about local accessible nature reserves in their area and volunteering opportunities. Once I established my campaign, I was really keen to put it into action, and last summer I conducted my first initial access audit for the Shropshire Wildlife Trust. This presentation will look at the overall current picture. The results of the access audit addressed many key concerns I had with regards to enabling disabled people to be able to access nature. The main 6 issues which came up out of the audit were interpretation, barriers, paths, the sensory experience, facilities, access statements and seating. I hope to explain clearly the issues which were found in these 6 areas and to offer some potential solutions. The first key piece of information I wanted to establish from my audit was which nature reserves had an access statement within their management plans. Whitcliffe Common was the only nature reserve to have an access statement with regards to accessibility for people wanting to explore the site. It was deeply concerning and worrying that out of all 6 of the nature reserves, that only one had an access statement as part of its management plan. Understanding the importance of the environment is a key priority at sites. However, people are just as much a part of nature reserves as the wildlife in which they're trying to conserve. I feel that it's important that all nature reserves have an access statement on their management plan, and that way both wildlife and people can be taken into consideration. During visits to various nature reserves, it became apparent that some sites were more accessible than others. Lightmoor was very overgrown and made it difficult to access the site, resulting in me having to climb over the gate, and many of the waymakers were covered. Though I do understand the Trust is currently managing this element of the nature reserve. However, Granville Nature Reserve has a lot of potential with its wide gate, which makes it easy for wheelchairs and buggies and mobility scooters, though its biggest barrier is the stairs, and there is a handrail which is good for people who may have mild physical disabilities, but it prevents wheelchair users from seeing the view from the top. A solution to this could be to put mounted photographs of the views at the bottom of the stairs. And the best nature reserve in terms of this was Whitcliffe Common, because of its open plan design and it being easily accessible via the Ludlow town centre. Out of all of them, Wood Lane was considered by far the best because it had large enough gates, again to allow wheelchairs, buggies, etc. to go through. Interpretation and signage were a universal issue across all the nature reserves. The text was all in the same format, however there was no braille or audio options, and none of the signs were tactile for people who have visual impairments, or there was no simpler signage for those with learning disabilities or multiple or profound disabilities, because the signage has reflective glass on it. This could mean that some people with visual impairments could struggle with the wording. Once again, Wood Lane came out on top because of the way in which it provides interpretation in the form of the talking rocks. I feel this is down to the fact that this site is primarily used for educational purposes. At this moment in time, none of the signage is suitable for people who have a learning disability or people who have a visual impairment. There are many ways in which this could be improved, such as adding braille and audio options to current signs, and by creating second signs with emphasis on simpler and bigger text and pictures, and signs that are tactile that would allow those with profound and multiple learning disabilities and visual impairments to get a sense of the environment around them. One area I feel that the Shropshire Wildlife Trust is not making enough of is the sensory experience, and on none of the sites there was no sensory trail. Not only would this benefit those with disabilities, but also non-disabled people as well. The charity The Sensory Trust offers Waymaker symbol kits that can be easily placed in nature reserves. A major issue which came across in the access audit was the lack of accessible toilets both on Wood Lane and Granville, as they are advertised as being accessible sites. I feel this is something that needs to be looked into and addressed in more detail, especially at this time when the Changing Places campaign states that over 250,000 people need accessible toilets to enable them to get out and about and enjoy day-to-day activities many of us take for granted. At Granville and Whitcliffe Common and in the bird hides at Wood Lane, the seating was of a basic nature. People with extra physical needs often require seating with more back support and armrests. Basic seating may not offer enough support. Granville provided one bench with this support. This is something I feel the Trust needs to look into in more depth. Gates, stiles, pathways and trails should be kept clear of excessive undergrowth, as this too can present barriers for those with physical limitations. Nature reserves should of course be as natural as possible, so this is an area for compromise where a balance must be struck between environment and accessibility. A good example of this was Whitcliffe Common, as it offers a range of pathways for all. I feel at this time, when nature and health are so integrally interlinked, it's great to see the Shropshire Wildlife Trust working with medical professionals to get to those who may have limited mobility or mental health and engage them with wildlife in their garden through the bird feeder project. However, as an organisation, I feel we could do even more to understand the needs of disabled people by making nature reserves accessible as possible without compromising the needs of wildlife and their conservation. As someone with a disability, I believe that we should always ask and never assume, and that a trust should further consult with both disability groups and parents groups before taking further action on these issues, as my initial access audit only touches the surface of accessibility on nature reserves. It's important that the voices of all disabled people and parents are heard, as my voice alone is not enough to speak for everyone in the county. By taking in the views of other disabled people and parents, the Trust will have even more evidence to go on and will be able to build up a greater picture of the needs before any changes are made. I see this accessible nature reserve project taking several years to complete and being done in consultation with a variety of representative groups, with the overall aim of improving nature reserves and access for all. The environment should always be preserved, and when discussing modifications, access, intelligent compromises should be the aim. As reported in 2015 in the Great British Tourism Survey, the Great British Day Visit Survey and the Disability Holiday Directory, 20% of UK tourism compromises of visits by those with some form of an impairment. 6% of impairments of those visiting attractions are typically mobility impairment and are wheelchair users. 47% of impairments are classified as long-term sick, and 25% of day trip groups aged 0 to 35 have some form of impairment. I feel in order to improve access, the Shropshire Wildlife Trust needs to invest. We need to invest our time into access and have a real look at this issue in depth. By not providing facilities and access, we are limiting a significant proportion of the population and also limiting the reach and the potential of the Shropshire Wildlife Trust. I would like to continue working alongside the Trust to make this a reality, as it is an area which I am very passionate about. For nature doesn't discriminate, and neither should we.